Management Society, Salt Lake chapter. I'm Dave Austin. And part of the mission of the BYU Management Society is to provide scholarships to service-oriented high school seniors. Each year, approximately 50 deserving students are awarded scholarships to local colleges and trade schools. If your family or business would like to join in providing scholarships to these future leaders by sponsoring a podcast, please contact us at byupodcast.slc@gmail.com. We'd love to talk with you. Each time we do one of these interviews, I am so excited for the opportunity, and I feel like I learn more than anyone else by the virtue of the chance to listen to each of our amazing guests. And today is no exception, as we have the marvelous opportunity to meet with Congressman Blake Moore. Born and raised in Ogden, Blake learned hard work and responsibility from his dad and optimism and service from his mom. Blake obtained a master's in public policy and administration from Northwestern University. He graduated from the University of Utah after serving a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Seoul, South Korea, and signing a scholarship to play as a quarterback at Utah State University. Before being elected to Congress, Blake worked for small businesses and in the Foreign Service experiences. These are experiences that now guide his work on domestic and foreign policy. As a principal at Cicero Group, Blake worked primarily in the social impact, marketing research, and strategy practice areas, leading projects and serving clients throughout Utah and the nation. Blake is married to Jane Boyer, his amazing, humorous, and very candid wife, who encourages him to take risks and pursue big things. Blake and Jane have 3 awesome and active boys who keep them on their toes, Max, George, and Winston. And even after being sworn in, Blake's most prized title is Little League Coach. Congressman Moore, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. That's that's great to hear again. I do have a great family, and it's been a unique journey. I can't believe we're just barely through the August recess, and so much has happened from January till the end of August. It's been amazing, and trying too. A lot of difficult things have happened.
Yeah, I can't imagine. And I guess my first question is, for our listeners around the country who may not know you, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, I think that bio does a decent job. I think my formative years were, mostly sports related. Enjoyed my time, and grew up in Ogden, went to Ogden High School. And then, things kind of transition in life, right? Like I go and sign to play for Dave Arslanian at Utah State. I go on my mission to Seoul, Korea. And while I'm on my mission, my scholarships gets cut because my coach got let go. And like you figure out your priorities in life, right? So I went down to Snow College for 1 semester and thought, you know what, let's end things on my term. Maybe things will play out. Had a great experience. And then I just wanted to go finish up school. So I came back up. Most my family were Utes. Let me be very clear about that. If we're on the front end of this, I had to answer that question a moment ago.
You're still a good guy.
Yeah. And they asked who I was cheering for. And I'm a very open book, candid politician, I'll be honest. And I'm going for the Utes, and you're just going to have to deal with that. And they're like, oh, you're going to lose votes. So be it. Anyway, so graduated from the University of Utah. And then I went, I just wrote an op-ed about 9/11. as that comes up. And, my experience with 9/11 wasn't like anything super remarkable. I was in actually an institute class at Snow College, an early morning institute before practice. And it had probably a very similar experience than many people. Captivated all day by the news. My sister, though, was a flight attendant. She left Dulles Airport the night on September 10th. So that was a little harrowing for our family because she was kind of grounded and stuck in Chicago. But, it was largely unremarkable, that September 11th. But what it led to was an interest in our diplomatic and intelligence community work. And I got to do that right out of college. Spent the first half of my career in that. And then the second half, I came back to Salt Lake, took a job with a company called Cicero Group. It's an awesome consulting firm that I probably honed better skills than anything else professionally in my life. And I looked at that service to the country, working in foreign policy and living abroad, then management consulting, working with the private sector, nonprofits, public organizations. It was the best prep for what I deal with in Congress. And while I'm not a typical, sometimes you run for a local official, and then a state legislator, and then you run. That's very typical, and there are a lot of my colleagues that are like that. But then there's a lot of my colleagues that came completely out of government and, jumped into this. I ran for this role because I felt like I had something practical, a very unique value proposition to support Hill Air Force Base, something that I've, grew up watching the jets fly off my back deck all the time, to something more aspirational on really building strong, inclusive, conservative principles for the future of our country. And, I'm trying to balance those two things. And that's what it is. That's what drove me to run, was that marrying those two things, the practical and aspirational piece. And we ended up in Congress. So here we are.
I read a headline about you that I think describes you well. It says Blake Moore dodges politics to promote productivity. One of our main issues is it seems that everyone is so entrenched in their positions that no one's willing to compromise. When we talk about moral and ethical leadership, how do we balance that while also needing to be able to compromise?
Yeah, and I love that headline. And if you could describe what I want to be, that's it. I'm still early in this role, and so I won't say that I've necessarily accomplished anything. That's for other people to determine about me, especially when you talk about moral and ethical leadership. That's for other folks to assess of me. My job is to be accessible, open, candid, and I hope that does bear out, because I talked a lot about it on the campaign trail, productivity over partisanship even, right? And I think part of that has to do with, what I call rising above two main things: rising above the rhetoric and rising above this sort of like breakdown of norms. And there are two big topics. We could spend all of our time. If you're interested more, we can discuss it a little bit, but we've got to be able to rise above a lot of this. You see so much rhetoric going on. I think that our communities and that our American citizens, I know there's more that binds us than divides. When you get into policy discussions, you ultimately have to choose yes or no, right? I don't get to choose, when a bill comes in front of me, I don't get to like nuance it anyway. I either support it or I don't. And then I go and make my statement about a particular piece of legislation. But finding a way to rise above the rhetoric. I get asked all the time, what's your biggest surprises in Congress? And I say, I can leave a meeting and then I can see it reported on either right-leaning or left-leaning media, and it's completely distorted. It is not the reality. It's not fact-based. And, trying to navigate that has been pretty fascinating, because the narrative gets set, and, sometimes it's hard to go against the grain. And I've had to do that several times. I felt compelled to do that. I've gone against my own leadership a handful of times. When I speak out against Democratic policies that are getting pushed through, like this current $3.5 trillion, I'm going to talk credibly about what I want to do differently and why I don't think this is a good thing. And not just say, why are the Democrats trying to ram this through? Because 4 years ago, through the budget reconciliation process, my party was accused of the same thing. Now, I agree with that policy. I agree with, making taxes globally competitive so our industries can thrive and provide more jobs and create more revenue. But going through that same process, both parties are guilty of it. And they when they have that trifecta of power, White House, House, and Senate, they push that through. Those are some of the norms that I talk about, that as we continue to break down these norms, and there's a lot of different things legislatively, we need folks that are willing to rise above it. And, I can do that from my perch as a freshman in the minority. It won't gain a lot of traction, but I hope that people will look at me as I, if I'm successful and I'm able if I'm fortunate enough to get more terms back here to put forth a lot of my vision, I hope people will look back and say, oh, he was willing to rise above a lot of the negativity and the rhetoric and reestablish some norms that are ultimately good for our government.
One of the things you just talked about in our webinar was President Oak's talk in General Conference. And I love the headline and the title of his talk, which is Defending the Constitution, which I think is an awesome word. Maybe can you talk a little bit about defending the Constitution and maybe about his talk in general?
Yeah, what I highlighted from that particular talk, there was like 3 big buckets of information. And what really stuck out to me, I think it's probably most relevant to me, is the breakdown of the separation of powers. So let me give 2 examples, one Republican, one Democrat. Well, actually, this is pretty much, a shot at everything. for just look at eviction moratorium. Okay. There was a time during the pandemic that the CDC and the executive branch kind of said, oh, we got to make sure that people aren't just going to get evicted, right? We don't know we don't know if we're going to be able to have restaurants open. Well, that time is like well over a year ago, right? We've got vast majority of our industries open, our schools are open, like things are moving again. We could debate all day about how you could make this work better. I think there's a lot of slow growth. We're paying people too much in unemployment insurance when there's countless jobs available. That aside, let's just talk eviction moratorium. The Supreme Court said this is Congress's job to decide on this. The executive branch cannot make this determination on whether to extend the eviction moratorium. The Biden administration ultimately agreed with that and punted it to Congress. On July 30th, I had to call my wife and say, hon, I have to stay in DC a whole nother day and like a half. I'm not going to get back to see. I know you've been on vacation with the kids down at the beach, which is not a vacation for her to take 3 kids as a pregnant mom of 3 to take them to the beach. I was going to get there for the weekend at least. And I called her and I said, hon, I got to stick around because what's happening is Democrats are taking off. There are some very brave Democrats, and I'm really close to a lot of these folks on Problem Solvers Caucus that don't agree with this policy, even though leadership's trying to push it on them. They got on a plane and they left, and they basically said, you can consider that my vote. I am not going to vote in favor of extending this again. We're just going to continue to kick the can down the road. And so a lot of brave Democrats were willing to do it. Now, to be brave, they just had to leave town, which is funny. But my job and many of my colleagues' job was to stick around and make sure that we would have the votes to beat it. There's only a 4 to 5 seat difference in Congress right now. That should create opportunities to work together where it's actually been it's been a lot more divisive because the balance of power shifted entirely to one party. But they left, the eviction moratorium expired, Congress actually made a decision. 2 days later, after some very, very active, very progressive individuals in the Democratic Party were threatening, were using social media, the CDC and the administration caved and extended the eviction moratorium. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled against it, that Congress had ruled against it, and because of some active social media, that the administration caved. That's fundamentally wrong. Now, the Supreme Court has stepped back in, and that's what should give us hope in this world where one party has control. Again, our party has been, if we had the White House, House, and Senate, we'd be pushing a lot of things through too. So the Supreme Court exists to be able to mitigate a lot of that. January 6th. You'd be surprised at how many folks, like, this is something the Democrats have done the last 2 elections, and I need to stand up for my constituents, and I'm going to do it too. That's a breakdown of norm. It's not, I do not believe that January 6th vote is our role. I don't believe it was constitutional for us to object to and not certify based on what we had. I believe in order for us to not certify an election, the states need to send 2 slates of electors. No states were asking us to do that. But because, and this isn't the only reason, there's a fault in my party for January 6th, absolutely. I'll never be on record saying otherwise than that. But it got distorted and thinking, Republicans took a ton of blame for this. And it was like, when I told people like, oh, the Democrats have done this very similar thing, not to the level of awareness among media by any stretch. And I think we may have blown up that norm, to the point where in 4 years, I hope folks are able to figure out we can't do that. But in Bush and Trump, Democrats did the same thing where they objected and didn't certify the election. Not as many, but that's what set it on to be like, well, Democrats do this all the time. I'm going to do this. Like, we can't have that, right? And so that's what I'm talking about when we have this breakdown of norms, and reestablishing that is a key need back in Washington. And those are kind of extreme examples. But it goes back to what President Oaks had talked about. It's a great message, and it's something that really hit home to me. And I really love that piece about separation of powers, because we have to preserve that.
Not if we want to remain a democratic society. We can't have that.
But there was lots of pressure from the executive branch on my colleagues on January 6th to do that. They weren't saying that. They weren't even saying that. They were just like, with like Pennsylvania, there was changes in the voter election laws that weren't proper, right? Absolutely were not proper. And, that was the discussion. It wasn't about overturning an election, but there was so much executive pressure on my congressional colleagues, like that we've got to be able to maintain that balance.
Yeah. One other thing you mentioned just barely that I wanted to hit on as well that I really liked, you said your goal was to present your conservative principles in a way that is more broadly acceptable to people. Can you talk a little bit about that and how do you go about doing that in this world that we live in?
Yeah, I love this platform too. There's a key piece of legislation called Fairness for All, and I'm an original co-sponsor. Representative Stewart has been leading the charge on this. This is taking what the Church of Jesus Christ has done with the LGBTQ community in Utah and finding a really proper balance between religious freedom and support and measures of equality for the LGBTQ community. And that's just one example, right? When I talk about being conservative principles, because the media is not necessarily on Republican side. Fox News is, other news networks that are coming up, that they do take a more conservative tilt. I typically follow a lot of the Wall Street Journal. Their editorial board aligns a lot of where I kind of, it aligns with my viewpoint, and I'll read the Times and the New York Times and the Washington Post to make sure I get a broad perspective. But we've got to this point where we, as Republicans and as conservatives, it's easy to say, oh, that's an old way of thinking, or that's not that's like not the new current or more in vogue approach. And I think that conservative principles are inclusive and they are aspirational for a really strong future for our country. And that Fairness for All is just an example of trying to take what we've done here in Utah, which most folks can look at and say that's been good. And when the Equality Act was getting pushed through the House floor, I remember reading an article from the Washington Post that talked about, we've got to be able to come together and respect religious freedom and making sure the exemptions are there, that we're not forcing so much of this on religions per se, but allowing for that community to have their dignity and their respect. Like, that's the kind of voice I want to be able to create. It's all, to me, it's about communication and voice. I want to be engaged on the climate issue, but not sensationalize it. Actually get to the root of the issue. But if you're willing to, present my plan, I get people hitting me on this in town halls, and industry has got a solid plan on how they're going about reducing emissions, and like that's not what sensationalized media will tell them, but in willing to engage on the topic, regardless of the topic, and communicate, a conservative viewpoint that isn't necessarily repulsive in any way, that can kind of cut through what the media accuses us sometimes of, and communicate in a positive, optimistic voice is what I'm ultimately, hopeful to be a part of.
Well, Congressman Moore, thank you. Thank you for being who you are. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it.
I love it. And I think that your viewers will love that it's semi-brief, so we could drown on and on for all this type of stuff. And I appreciate folks willing to engage and get involved. I love that, be a part of this, and anything we can do in the future, let us know.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our listeners. We'll be back again next week with another episode of our Moral and Ethical Leadership Podcast. Have a great week.